So I've been with Bats Northwest for about a year and a half. I'm working on a master's in formal education and conservation, and bats have long been a hobby and study, and hopefully more and more focus of mine. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to do a little bit of quick kind of bat 101. I'm sure a lot of you guys already know things about bats, some of the biology of bats, but there's always some misunderstandings. There's always people who haven't been to one of our talks before. So I'm going to kind of go through that a little quick so that we get the info, but then we can move on to Sally's section, which is going to be a lot more about our Northwest species and the benefits they have here for us directly in this area. And then I'll be back with a little bit more how we can help bats and the species integrated into our lives and have them benefit us in our orchards and gardens and stuff like that. So without further ado, so as we know, bats are mammals. They're the only mammals capable of full flight. We have some gliding mammals in the world, but nobody else can actually power themselves through the air. Bats are not rodents, which means they don't chew or gnaw on things the way rats or squirrels do. Kind of a common misconception. Instead, bats make up an order unto themselves called Chiroptera, which also has to be one of my favorite words because I think it's super fun. So Chiroptera means hand wing in Latin. That's because unlike birds who flap their wings, primarily move through their arms to fly, bats have a really unique hand structure that they use for flying. Like you can see in the skeleton, they have hugely elongated finger bones on each hand, and their wing membrane stretches between those finger bones. And they fly not only with their arms, but most of their power and maneuverability actually comes through their fingers, which gives them some mind-boggling maneuverability and precision in flight. They're really kind of like acrobats in the sky, much more than some of our birds can be. Just to kind of give you an example so you can kind of see how this works and looks in a bat. This is Freddie. I'm going to play this short video. This is Freddie. He's a little red fox at a rehabilitation center in Australia. And you can see how his whole arm and his finger bones are visible through that wing membrane. Currently, he's working on rebuilding wing strength, so he's flapping to build up muscles. But you can get an idea how much motion he's going to get out of all that when he actually flies. This is the one I speak this. Come on. There we go. All right. So most people don't realize that there's actually 1,400 species of bats in the world. Officially, I think the last scientific count was 1,411, but then they discovered a new species in Africa this month, so I think it's now 1,412. But so bats actually make up about 20% of all mammal species in the world. So it's a lot of bats, and they're all very, very different. The world's smallest bat is a bumblebee bat that measures just 1.1 to 1.3 inches. It's about the size of your thumb, and he only weighs 2 grams when he's full grown. On the other hand, the world's largest bat is a giant golden crowned flying fox, and he has a wingspan of 5 to 6 feet. So that's a longer wingspan than I am tall. Both of these bats are found in Thailand. So there's bat species in habitats all over the world, except for the North and South poles, because it's just too cold. So they're all over the world. They're in all of our habitats and all of our ecosystems. Chiroptera are divided into 2 main groups, known as Microchiroptera, or the microbats, and Megachiroptera, or the megabats, which are also commonly known as flying foxes. Sorry. Computer is having a hiccup. All right, our megabats, there are actually less than 200 different species of megabats in the world. They have longer snouts and a very sensitive smell that helps them find fruit and sweet flowers with really good nectar. Most of our megabats are fruit bats, and therefore they really rely on that sense of smell. Megabats also rely on sight to find food, and therefore have larger eyes that take in more light so they can see better at dusk or during the night. They tend to have smaller ears, but they're very mobile ears with a lot of movement to them so that they can hear those predators approaching from any direction. Meanwhile, our microbats consist of the smaller insect-eating bats usually. All the bats in Washington and pretty much all the bats in the United States are microbats. They have smaller eyes, and though they can see, bats are not blind, they see about as well as you and I do, but they don't rely on sight to find their food. Instead, microbats use echolocation. Therefore, microbats have larger ears that are designed to hear and even feel the echolocation calls that they use, and a wide variety of nose shapes and even faces that are designed to help them with their echolocation a lot more than they use their sense of smell. All right, echolocation. So echolocation is the use of sound waves and echoes to determine where objects are in space. Much like dolphins and some varieties of shrews, bats use echolocation to navigate and to find food in the dark. So to echolocate, they send out sound waves from their mouth or nose. When the sound waves hit an object, they produce that echo. That echo bounces off the object and returns to the bat's ears or nose flaps or face to help them figure out where those objects are, how big it is, how it's moving, and what it looks like. Echolocations are mostly silent to us, humans, but it's only just because we don't hear at that frequency. Bat echolocation calls are generally between about 16 to 120 kilohertz. Humans can only hear up to about 20 kilohertz, but if we could hear the echolocation calls in the sky every night, it would actually sound a bit like a war zone or a sky filled with fire alarms and car alarms going off. So I, for one, am really thankful we can't hear it, because when I go out and see swooping bats, it seems really peaceful and quiet from where we are. So there's some great technology that bat scientists use to actually translate those high frequency calls into something that we can hear, so we can kind of understand how bats use their echolocation. This video I'm about to show is from the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and they've actually done that for us so that we can hear how bats use those calls. When I play the video, you're going to first hear kind of just their navigational calls. It's a very consistent sounding, regular beat call that helps them see where they're going. As they actually start to hunt and find their food or hone in on prey, those calls increase in frequency and become much quicker because they need much more specific information. This video is also great because we can see those hand wings in motion, and you can see how they use them not only to fly, but to swoop, to scoop up moss like they've got a catcher's glove on, and they even use their tail membranes to flip food towards their mouth so they can eat. So I'm gonna play that real quick. All right, so that's kind of how bats, insectivore bats, go after their food and use echolocation. Did anybody notice the one he dropped and decided didn't taste very good? I like that part of it. I'm not gonna replay it. Come on, there we go, sorry. So if you look at all 1,400 bat species, you're gonna find three main functions that bats fill in our ecosystem. A key role for our fruit bats is that of seed dispersers. Most of our megabats are fruit bats, and most species are primarily either frugivorous or nectivorous, or a bit of both. That also includes some leaves and pollen and twigs and other things that they eat. So seed dispersal is a really important function for our ecosystem because regenerating clear-cut forests in particular that may have been destroyed by a flood, an earthquake, or man-made reasons is a really complex natural process, and it's one that requires seed scattering by many animals besides bats. And while a lot of fruit-eating animals drop seeds back into the ground, the droppings are typically occurring in proximity to where those animals live or from the very tree that they got those seeds from. However, night foraging fruit bats, on the other hand, they cover vast distances every night and are really willing to cross clearings a lot more than some birds or animals like birds or small mammals might do so during the day, just because they have less predators out at night. So the seeds dropped by bats can account for up to 95% of the new growth in an area of barren forest. That's what they call pioneer plants. So they're really important for that. And they can eat up to 2 times their weight in fruit every night. So they're very effective seed dispersers. Another ecosystem role that bats fill is as pollinators. We don't have pollinating bats here. There are some in the Southwest states and in Mexico, but they're very important pollinators for many plants. Unlike bees and butterflies and a lot of our daytime pollinators, bats show up at work for work at night, and they don't get a lot of credit for their hard work in pollination. They can cover really long distances each night, and they can carry a tremendous amount of pollen on their faces and in their fur. That pollination is a very important role because they're the most efficient of our nocturnal pollinators, and they're the main pollinators for some really important foods like bananas, agaves, and avocados. Certain plants, especially desert cactus species, have actually evolved to target bats with their sweet-smelling, night-blooming flowers. So there's certain cactus varieties that studies have found actually stagger their bloom times among the cactus species so that they can all benefit as much as possible from their bat visitors. And then the last ecosystem role that our bats fill is actually filled by about 2/3 of all bat species, and that's our insect-eating or insectivorous bats. So these bats can save US farmers roughly $3.7 billion each year by reducing crop damage and limiting the need for pesticides. Most on average can eat about half their body weight in insects every night, and pregnant or nursing mothers actually consume 100% of their body weight in insects every night. These bats help control disease-spreading insects like mosquitoes, and at least here in Washington, they make our long summer nights even better by keeping some of those bugs away from our gardens and from us. So I'm going to turn this over to Sally now, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the benefits of our native bat species.
Hello, I'm Sally Lawrence. I'm a volunteer with Bats Northwest. And first of all, Nikki and I are very grateful for this opportunity to share information about bats. So thank you for the invitation. So who are Bats Northwest? We're, as you see in this photo, we're an eclectic bunch of volunteers. Bats Northwest is a nonprofit based in Seattle. And amongst our organization, we have 2 bat rehabilitators, 2 or 3 bat researchers, a former caver, and others who simply love bats and are taking lots of time to learn about them and share this information with the public. Before COVID, we used to go out to schools and talk about bats to elementary school kids. And we set up exhibits at farmers markets. 2 years ago, we had a booth at the Snohomish Fruit Society Festival in Monroe. There's so much that scientists don't know about bats worldwide or our local bats. So part of our mission here in Seattle is to learn more about our local bats and share this information with the public in order to protect them. Nearly all the bat species in North America are insect eaters. And in fact, all 14 species in Washington state are insect eaters. So this is a huge benefit to agriculture nationwide. For example, in cucumber growing country, big brown bats, a single colony of them can eat 600,000 cucumber beetles in a year. And that prevents 33 million cucumber beetle larvae from eating next year's crop. Another example, in Texas and other cotton growing states, Mexican free-tailed bats are known to eat cotton bollworm moths. And it's estimated that bat predation on the moths has saved $23 billion annually for those cotton growing regions. So amongst our local bats, on the left with that tawny colored fur, you see the big brown bat. And on the right is a Yuma myotis. And I just want to mention, we have gotten permission from this fabulous photographer, Michael Durham, to use his photos. So these are 2 of our local bats, and I'll be talking a little bit about some data we have for them. But just to answer a question you may have about how far bats fly at night when they're foraging, I've done a screen capture here of a website called Bats About Our Town. This is put up by Greg Falksa, a bat researcher down in Olympia. And he has put a lot of information about bats in Thurston County on this website. And one of the stories he tells is that there's a mixed colony of Yuma bats and little brown bats that the maternity colony, it's females only, live under a Weyerhaeuser, an abandoned Weyerhaeuser pier. And at night, these female bats fly 8 miles to Capitol Lake in Olympia. They forage there for insects. They go back to the pier at midnight to nurse their babies. back to Capitol Lake before dawn, and then back to their babies. So that's an 8-mile, twice a night round trip for those female bats. Locally, we have Bats Northwest conducted almost monthly surveys of the bats in Mercer Slough, which is a 320-acre nature park in Bellevue. The nature park has 4 different habitat types. The slough itself is called Kelsey Creek, and this discharges to Lake Washington. There's a commercial U-pick blueberry farm on the west side of Kelsey Creek. There's a scrubby willow wetland forest that includes a couple of open meadows in the center. And there's finally a strip of old Doug fir western red cedar forest on a steep slope on the east side of the park. So we conducted 23 acoustic surveys over 4 years, more of them in summer than winter. So what did we learn? First I'll mention that what you see one of our volunteers holding is called a handheld bat detector. And this translates those high frequency echolocation calls to a series of chirps that we human beings can hear. And we record the chirps and take the recordings back to our home computers where we can look at the spectral analysis. And that tells us which species is making the call. So I'll share a little bit of data from those 4 years of surveys. I don't want to overwhelm you, but I want you to look at the general pattern here. The y-axis is the number of identified calls. We're not counting bats, we're just recording call activity. And that we have to be careful when we describe the data, because we'd love to know how many bats were out there, but all we actually know is the number of calls. So for example, if you look at the pattern of the blue columns in this figure, looking over the year from January on the left to December on the right, the California myotis has the blue columns. You can see, as you would expect, the higher columns with more calls occur in the summer, May through August. But the California myotis is present. It shows up a little bit in January, November, and not December, but October, November, and March. And so those are cold months of the year here. In contrast, the little brown myotis, those red columns, has a much more limited presence from April through September. And the third bat that we heard most frequently was the silver-haired bat, and it occurred between March and looks like October here. And silver-haired bats are known to migrate, so it may be that they have actually left the area during those coldest winter months. So just going back to that observation about California myotis, that it did show up in the winter. What scientists think is that this bat uses what we call a snack and snooze strategy. It doesn't go into full hibernation in the winter. It stays present and tucks itself under tree bark, under rocks and wood piles, and it's sensitive to the temperature during the day and whether there are insects out. So on some of those warm days when we see lots of midges around our back doors or our front doors, the California myotis can sense that there's a hatch of insects. It comes out, it eats, and then it goes back to being a couch potato. But these other two species, the little brown myotis and the silver-haired bat, we really don't know a lot about where they're going during the winter. And that's something that Bats Northwest is interested in learning more about. And I have to tell you, just one of the most extraordinary times when I was helping with these surveys in Mercer Slough, a companion and I were walking through the meadow, and we saw an owl, a barred owl, up in one of the trees, and we were taking a few pictures, and it was dusk. It hadn't got fully dark yet, so we saw the owl. And it started following us as we continued through a path to look for bats. And all of a sudden, a bat flew out and the owl tried to grab it, but thankfully it did not succeed in capturing the bat. So yes, owls are successful predators on bats. And so whenever we heard an owl hooting in Mercer Slough, we knew that we would probably not get any bats that night because they're very smart and they go away if the owls are out. So besides owls, what are the other threats to bats in both across the US, around the world, and right here west of the Cascades? One of them is climate change. Some bats live in very arid parts of the country, and if these regions become more arid and water sources dry up, then bats won't be able to live in those places anymore. Wind turbines are a factor in bat fatalities. Like birds, those blades can encounter the bats and the birds. So at dusk, there needs to be a lot more research on the operation of wind turbines to reduce those fatalities of bats and birds. Habitat loss is a factor for bats, just like other wildlife. As we humans move our homes into the foothills, up into the mountains, trees usually get cut down, and this removes also wetlands as we remove areas of agriculture and wetlands that provide the insects that bats need. These are all factors that reduce the populations that can be supported in our local environments. Fear is a big factor in bats. Every Halloween, you may see some articles in the newspaper about, the scariness of bats and Dracula stories and vampire bats. So what we at Bats Northwest have done over the past few years, as well as other bat protection organizations, we have asked our Governor Inslee, to declare Bat Week at the end of October. I think it's from October 24th through the 31st. And we provide accurate articles about how helpful bats are and why it's not necessary to be afraid of them. So that's one way we use the news media instead of spreading fear, to spread accurate information. In a couple of slides, I will get to white nose syndrome. But first, I'd like to mention that some cultures around the world are not so much afraid of bats. This is the Arc de Triomphe in Barcelona. And that's a close-up on the left of a bat sculpture, which is located on both sides of this arch. And the story goes that King James I, back in the 12th century, he was fighting a battle and a bat woke him up in the middle of the night, enabling him to get out and conduct battle on his enemies and win the battle. So he's venerated here in this arch. In China, another example of where bats are not so much an object of fear, the word fu means good fortune, and it sounds a lot like the word for bat, which is bien fu. And so there's some association in China with good fortune. So moving along to white nose syndrome, it was first documented in the eastern United States in 2006. And around 2010, there were lots and lots of news articles about the millions of bats that were dying during their hibernating period in eastern North America. It was first discovered in Washington State in a bat that was found in North Bend, so very close to us here, in 2016. And our state agency, Department of Fish and Wildlife, has been tracking white nose syndrome in the state, has found it in more than one bat species, including the little brown myotis, the one that's been so decimated in eastern North America. So the fungus does spread easily within caves. And so bats that hibernate are particularly vulnerable to this fungus. This is a bat-only disease. It cannot be passed to humans, but humans may contribute to its spread. So what the fungus does, it irritates the skin of the bat. It wakes them out of hibernation. So they start expending energy. They start using up the fat reserves. They're supposed to stay asleep during hibernation. The fungus can invade the skin tissue and damage the wings. This affects their ability to fly. It also affects their ability to regulate their body temperature and their breathing, and they may become dehydrated. So what can we do? We don't have a treatment for white nose syndrome. We can only influence our own behavior right now. So we ask that folks who are cavers observe all cave closures and advisories, avoid going into caves that have hibernating bats, and anyone who is a researcher or a caver who is even in the summertime going into into caves that may have hibernating bats at other times of year, you should decontaminate your boots and any clothing before and after visiting caves and mines. So the other information on this slide is not related to white nose syndrome, but it's other kinds of behavior we can adopt to protect bats. One particularly important point down in the bottom left here, if you do find bats in your home and you don't want them there, your best resource information is with your local natural resource agency and with State Department of Fish and Wildlife. It has information on their website on how to remove bats without hurting them. And particularly important not to try to remove bats between about May 1st and the end of September. That is the maternity season. And so you not only have the females going, flying out and coming back during the night, but the babies are staying inside much of the time. So you may be trying to remove adults, but if you seal up the openings, then the babies will get trapped inside and will die. So State Department of Fish and Wildlife also is interested in your information about where bats are roosting. And if you find a sick bat or an injured bat or a dead bat, they want all those reports, and there are places on their website to report these injuries. So we at Bats Northwest have done some cooperative work with Fish and Wildlife where we've helped them assess bat colonies. And so if you report either to DFW or to Bats Northwest, we can gauge how big a colony may be. But we not only want to protect the bats, we want to protect you too. And most people know that bats do carry rabies. It's not a huge percentage. It's estimated that just 1% of wild bats carry rabies. However, if you do see a bat that's behaving oddly, it's on the ground, it can't seem to fly, it may be sick, it may have rabies. So no matter what that low percentage is, always protect yourself if you are planning to capture a bat. Always wear gloves and trap it either in a cardboard box or a plastic device like this person is doing here. So if you find a sick bat, that should be reported to your local public health department. And it's possible there's a couple times a year when a young bat may be perfectly healthy but may end up on the ground, and that's kind of late summer or early spring. They're coming out of a dormant period and they're still young. They haven't really learned to fly that well. They may end up on the ground and not be able to take off from the ground. So if you capture one and put it on a branch from which it can drop and fly again, that's a really successful approach for helping a bat. So I'm not going into any details about coronavirus. I'm certainly not an expert on the science that's being done. But you probably have heard that the wet markets in China may have been where a bat bit another animal, and maybe that's how it got into humans. So we don't have a final answer on that, but there's an excellent article that I'd recommend you read by David Quammen. It was in the New York Times last December, and here's the reference. And it covers a lot of ground. It talks a lot about the value of bats in ecosystems, and it also talks about the coronavirus disease. Now, here's a website at Department of Fish and Wildlife for your concerns about bats. If you have a bat in your house, it gives some advice about removal. I have, whoops, there should be one more slide. Okay, this is the other slide with some references. Douglas Tallamy is a writer, an entomologist who published Nature's Best Hope in 2020. It's a really excellent kind of view of how we can improve the our yards, our backyards, our front yards, our orchards, the property that we can manage, and how we can encourage nature to thrive, even with the kind of cultivation that we're trying to do with flowers and orchards around our house. And finally, here's a good reference about white nose syndrome that is on Department of Fish and Wildlife's website. So that concludes my part of the talk. Now we'll go back to my partner in crime, Nikki Desautels. And again, thank you so much for this invite.
All right, thanks, Sally. So bats are super amazing creatures. So the next part we're going to talk about is how do we keep them around and how do we help them thrive? You can certainly donate to a bat conservation organization, follow some of those groups online and keep learning about bats. It's a great way to stay involved or become a bit of a bat advocate yourself, or become a volunteer when the world goes back to a more volunteering state. But there's lots of great ways that you can help bats right from your own home. So I'm going to go over a little bit more of the importance of preserving habitat, gardening practices that can support and encourage bats, and then we're going to talk about bat houses and how they help bats and you. Yes, my slides will move. Come on. There we go. All right, so like Sally mentioned, habitat destruction is a huge threat to all of our bat species. Overexploitation, including land development, removal of native plants, and an influx of invasive species is the main factor in 72% of all species facing extinction. Not only new construction, but just the way that we maintain our own private natural space is really important to bats' abilities to thrive, both in cities and in the country. While our bats here in the Northwest will use bat houses for maternity colonies, we have a lot of tree-dwelling critters here. A healthy tree canopy cover is really important to bats. They utilize so much of the trees in their day-to-day lives, including using trees as navigational aids, perching from foliage for protection, foraging for insects among the branches. Bats around here roost in cracks and splits, crevices, behind loose bark or in dense ivy, and even in woodpecker and rot holes. Some local species are even known to hibernate through the winter in the hollow of tree trunks. So it's not only our live forest patches that are important to bats, but dead and downed trees are essential to bats and a lot of our local wildlife. So if you can leave standing snags, which are trees that have died but not fallen yet, or logs, you can create entire ecosystems for our bats and for the insects that they eat. Bats in the Northwest really need it warm, especially in the winter, but even in the summer when they're sleeping. That's why they seek out those dead trees like snags. As that wood decomposes, it lets off heat, it generates heat, and they actually use that to stay warm while they're sleeping. So if you can safely leave a dead or fallen tree, you're creating a great habitat for a lot of native species in our area. For that same reason, you're sometimes going to come across bats huddled up in wood piles, especially our silver-haired bats really like that during the winter months. So when you stack and unstack your wood piles, be careful. They might be sleeping in those warm, dry bundles of wood. All right, so like all native species, or at least around here, bats need food, shelter, and water to survive. One way you can actually help them is to help provide those things as an integrated part of our homes and properties. If you have animals on a farm, then you're probably already doing that. But another way you can do that is to plant a native garden. Native plants attract a native ecosystem, which in turn attracts native predators like bats. bats need sufficient insects to eat, and intentional planting can help keep them around. So to attract bats, if that's something you want to a little bit more in your life, you can consider sweet smelling and night blooming plants. So some species that grow really well in the Northwest include phlox, yarrow, 4 o'clock, and some varieties of evening primrose. Planting native plants and keeping our yards natural helps everyone in our ecosystem, including these bats, who in turn help us by keeping our food-growing plants and trees safe from those nocturnal pest insects. Bats need lots of fresh water. Unlike a lot of other mammals, bats actually drink on the wing by lapping up small amounts of water with every pass over a body of water. You can help bats and all wildlife by improving access to fresh, clean water. If you have or ever plan to install a pond, you greatly enhance the odds that bats will use your property or use a bat house that you may have erected for them. So be sure your pond has open areas along the edges so bats can access that water. And if a pond's not an option, if you don't live near a river, a stream, or a lake, even bird baths are used by bats. So it's important to keep, for the bats and the birds and everyone else, to keep that water really clean. I'm actually going to drop in the chat, if anyone wants to grab the link, a couple really good PDFs about gardening for nocturnal pest control animals like bats, and a native plant finder. You guys may have some of this, but I always like to make it available. So those links go to some really good resources about not only what you can do, but how to do it. All right. All right. So, all right, bat houses. If you build a bat house right, bats may come eventually. So bat houses are great for maternity colonies in the late summer and spring and summer. Western Washington has a lot of shelter options for our bats. So sometimes when you put up a bat, I've met lots of people who didn't have bats move in right away. They just might not need it yet, but bat houses are still really important and very worthwhile. If bats are ever excluded from their space, if you're someone who's had bats living in your siding or your attic and you're hoping to safely exclude them, which means to encourage them to find other homes by creating things like one-way doors outside of maternity season, bat houses are some place that those bats may either naturally or with a little bit of encouragement move into. They're also great in case there's development going on in your area. If trees are being downed or people are renovating, moving old barns or taking down sheds, then a lot of times bats will start looking for new homes. And that's when it's great that they have the availability of bat houses in the area. But it's really important in the Northwest. We actually have a whole lot of special needs for our bat houses. Sometimes you'll go into a hardware store or somewhere like that and you'll find a bat house and it looks really cool and you want to put it up. I know when I was just becoming a student of bats, I totally did this myself and I ended up buying a bat house that was really meant for bats in much warmer climates, like in Texas or New Mexico. It was the wrong shape, it was the wrong color. Nobody used it because it wasn't built for Northwest bats. So we're going to talk you through a few of the differences and kind of show you what our Northwest bats really need out of their bat houses. All right, so here in the Northwest, placement is super important. Like I mentioned before, bats in the Northwest like it hot. So it's really important that your bat house be heated by the sun as much as possible. It needs to be installed in full sun. That can be hard in the Northwest. But we'll kind of get to some ways to make that work. So that's actually the reason why if you see bat houses from Bats Northwest, one of the things we have to do in the Northwest is paint all of our bat houses black. You ever see the cedar ones that can be really pretty? They don't absorb as much heat, and our bats here need all of the sun and all the heat they can possibly get. So we always paint our bat houses black. The best option here, not the only option, but one of the best options is to actually put a bat house on a pole in an open area. Bats avoid places where predators like cats and rats and raccoon could hide and easily reach their bat boxes. So building mounted bat house needs to be placed high away from predators and in the sun. So a masonry surface like a chimney is often a good option. Or if there's somewhere high enough up on your house, but far enough from the eaves that a predator could hop over, then that'll be a good option too. but the poles are usually about 12 to 15 feet high if you go that route. And bats really need about a 30-inch viewable space so that they can take off while checking for predators. So if it's too close, like we don't want to hang bat houses here in the trees. It's way too easy for predators to get there, or anything that's too close to overhanging branches where a crafty squirrel or somebody like that could jump. Or if they can't see when they're starting to take off to tell if there's a hawk or an owl there, then they're probably not going to want to hang out there. So bats also need a landing pad to be able to get back into their house. They don't really just swoop all the way up in there without stopping along the way. So a pole is great if it has a bit of a rough surface that they can get their little claws on and climb up. Or if you use more of a house mounted on a building, like the ones in the pictures, you'll see that they have a little landing pad that actually has a rough surface as well for them to climb back up. So our bats need really small spaces, and both of the houses I'm going to talk about meet those needs for our bats. So the first one, which is our chamber houses, our chamber houses have large, narrow chambers that allow bats to thermoregulate by either cuddling close together and being contained in the wood, or spreading out apart from each other when they need to cool down. The other really popular boxes that are great here in the Northwest are called rocket boxes. And that's the ones here on the pole, looks like a rocket. And on the inside of that thing, you can see in the diagram, it's actually cut wood so that they maintain those really small, it should be about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch space for those bats to move up and through. And it does the same thing. It gives them enough space that they can spread out in there if they need to. But if it's a cold night and they need more, then they're going to cuddle up together. We have bat house resources and building plans on our Bats Northwest website. There's also a whole lot of great plans on Bat Conservation International's website, which is one of the biggest bat conservation sites that's based in the US. I'm also going to put in a couple more links in there for you so that you can look at some if you want to build your own. We also, when we visit farmers markets and garden shows, have them available. We just haven't been able to do that yet this year. But we do sell them ourselves as a fundraiser for Bats Northwest. So one more really important thing about bat houses. If you put up a bat house, it's really important that you maintain it. Bat houses need to be checked on twice a year, once in the summer, kind of to see if it's occupied, very carefully, of course. And then once in the winter, and if it's not occupied in the winter, it should really be cleaned out a little bit. I'm going to put a video in the chat as well that kind of talks about bat house maintenance. But don't put up a bat house and forget about it. It's really important that we keep making sure that it's habitable for those bats, so that if someone hasn't moved in, or if it's being used in the summer and not the winter, it's always habitable when those bats are ready to use it. So, let me jot those links real quick. All right. There you go. All right. So I know a lot of you probably live out where you've seen bats before, but sometimes we often encounter people who have never seen a bat. And there are a lot of bat species here in Washington. So I always like to include this little tips and tricks if you want to go and kind of have a really safe bat experience, just to view them when they're out at night. So sometimes it can be right outside your home, and sometimes it's a well-planned trip to the park. Like Sally, I live in King County and I'm in Seattle, and I can see them here between usually about April and September, when the most of our bat species are frequented. And since I live near a lake, I've actually found a spot where I can see them every single night during that time period, if I just know when and where to look. So like Sally said, we've got bats that are active all year, but our most active density of bats is from about April till September. So my trick for going to find bats is checking the weather report and seeing what time dusk is and what time last light is. There's usually in the summer, it's usually about an hour between the two. And that's the best time I've found to go and find bats. So pick a spot. Bats are commonly seen in places where they have access to food, so bugs, shelter of trees, and fresh water. In non-COVID times, Bats Northwest does summer bat walks at Green Lake, where we go to see bats, and we're able to find them almost every time we go there. On the other hand, my mom lives in Granite Falls, near one of the state wetland areas, and the pond behind her house has so many species of bats whenever I visit it just after sunset. So once you found that kind of spot, get comfy and look up. Bats are easiest to spot before all the light is gone. So I found that the time right between sunset and last light is when I can still see them silhouetted out the sky. And those first bats are heading out for their first meal of the night. Sometimes I get the question, how do I know if I'm looking at a bird or a bat? It's just a little bit of practiced observation skills. It's taking the time to sit and listen and look around to see if there are other birds that you can see more easily. Resting in the trees, can you hear birds? Most of them go to bed at sunset. They're usually sheltered by then. And all of our nocturnal birds are a lot bigger than bats. So if the chirping has ceased and the birds are gone, you're most likely watching a bat. And then watch how it flies. We saw in that video how erratic and different bats fly than birds. So you'll kind of be able to see. You might not see a bat every time you go out, but if you keep it up, and you're probably going to see them soon, try a couple different spots, find that fresh water source, and you'll probably get to see some cool bats. So I wanted to, before I wrap up, just share this last video. This is actually the pond I mentioned where my parents live, and they set up a night camera to get some of their nocturnal activity, and we definitely got to see bats through that. Anyway, it's a fun way to kind of have a little bit of a different nature experience than we usually get to experience. Come on, there we go. Okay, just have a couple more resources for you. The Bat House and Native Gardens are similar to ones I dropped in the chat, but if you guys are interested in talking more to Bats Northwest or coming out to volunteer or join us sometime, here's our information. I'm going to turn it back to Becky so we can answer some questions.